Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. I am Surya Gangadharan and welcome to the second in our series of roundtables on issues of foreign policy and security. This roundtable is on tech and I have a fairly distinguished panel with me. We are basically going to look at a whole range of issues here, including the Techscape, the challenges before India, and government policy, rules and regulations, and so on. So let me begin with first introducing my co-anchor, Anil Padmanabhan, former managing editor of The Mint, currently running Capital Calculus on Strat News Global. Also to my left, Jaijit Bhattacharya, who runs his own digital policy think tank. Smita Purshottam, former diplomat, who runs Sitara, an indigenous agency focusing on indigenous technologies. Subrata Mitra of Ather Energy, he's head of government policy and liaison. Shatakratu Sahu of the Carnegie, he's a research analyst looking at AI, among other things. And we have Commodore Arun Golaya, who headed innovation in the Navy or drove it and is currently a budding entrepreneur. So there we have it. Let's start with a brief kind of sense from each of you as to how, from your own perspective, you see the tech landscape in India and where it's going. Jaijit?
So, Surya, I would like to actually go back a few hundred years to explain how the tech landscape evolves. Indian shipping industry was killing the British shipping industry while Britain was ruling India. And so the shipwrights went to the King of Britain and said that, look, when your navy needs repairs and maintenance and new ships, you won't see us around because the Indian shipping industry would have killed us by then. So do something, and otherwise we won't be around. So 1813, they passed a law saying that no Indian ships will be allowed to come to Britain, and there'll be a special extra tax on them. And then subsequently next year, they passed another law which said that no ships from Indian origin can float under the British flag in the transatlantic route, which is a very lucrative trade because they would pick up slaves from West Africa, dump them in America, pick up gold from America, dump it in UK, and then continue to do that. And the Indian ships were bigger, better, cheaper, had a much more longer lifespan. Now, because of these two laws, Indian shipping industry completely got finished off. So when the next generation of technologies came, which is the iron ships, India was not around. And so India did not have the technology. Now you look back and say, oh, Britain is very, very progressive, has progressed in shipping industry. India is not there. Now, the reason I want to put this context in is that India has not been there in multiple technologies. We have been pushed out from metallurgy, from cutting edge steel, from all kinds of cutting edge technology. India is not known for any. We have been the number 4 country or number 3 country, at max the number 2 country in getting into any technology. We have never been the number 1 for a very long time now. And therefore, the question has to be that what is it that we need to change in the ecosystem to be the number 1? Also, is there any other paradigm that we need to look at to be number 1? Now, a good example is China. In 2004-ish, they woke up and they realized that they are getting beaten by the West through a network of unfair trade regulations and managing IPR. It was a concept that was pushed into the East from around 1960 onwards, IPR, patents, copyrights, and so on and so forth. Now, these terms were around, but they were never aggressively pushed in. They got pushed in from 1960 onwards because the last of the colonies went out from 60s onwards. And therefore, the framework that has been created is that the West will continue to create technologies and charge undue economic benefit out of it, essentially rent seeking, and whatever the East produces will be treated as raw materials and therefore charged at a very, very low cost. And so to change that, China went on an offensive, did a series of steps which I think is worthwhile to emulate. They put a deadline that they should be leaders in multiple identified areas. Let's say EV as an example. Between 2009 and 2020, they spent $29 billion to promote the EV industry, and they are now the world's leaders in EV industry, undoubtedly. Right? So that is the kind of commitment that was put in by the Chinese government. Unless the government and industry works in tandem and with a clear strategy as to what is the segment that we are addressing, when there is a disruption, we'll not be able to break into the entity which creates the next generation of technology. Now, the Chinese identified that EV is going to break, is a disruption, Everybody else is focusing on ICE vehicles. The Japanese are saying my hybrids are 40% better than the ICE vehicles, so there is no other incentive to become better than that. China stepped in and said, look, there is a disruption. EVs are coming in, batteries coming in, let's invest into the entire supply chain. And there are multiple such examples that I can carry on, but I'll just take a pause. That's a model that we need to emulate. India is doing well with its own models, with the startups coming in, and we have seen the Agnikul rocket firing off. It's a 3D printed rocket. It's going to make rockets as competitive as Elon Musk's reusable rockets. And that's one model, but there is much more to be done to make sure that the ecosystem switch happens. And I think when we come back, I'll explain what that ecosystem means and how it controls IPR and how rent seeking happens and how we need to shift that balance into India's favor.
Smita?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me in this very prestigious panel. And we have been focusing on indigenization of technology since 2011. And we focused initially on defense. Well, why technology? I mean, it's self-evident, that the more prosperous societies are those which have invested in technology. And Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he proved it, and his conclusion was that 90% of growth in the American economy in the first half of the 20th century, 90% was fueled by technological progress. And we can replicate that model in India because we have the talent today. We're outsourcing it, we're creating value in other countries. If we create the right conditions here, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, technology is also extremely important for national security. Look at what's happening in the Ukraine-Russian battlefield. The Americans are watching what's going on there and learning. The Chinese have just scrapped their strategic support force because they're taking lessons from the information warfare tactics. And Russia is able to withstand the mighty $1.26 trillion annual spend of the NATO bloc with a fraction of the cost, mainly because they have an indigenous defense industrial base and indigenous innovation capabilities. We have an imported weapons park. And we have been working to convince government to take very proactive steps. They have done some good things like funding the AMCA development, giving huge orders for the Tejas, but there is still a very long way to go. And one critical reform that they could implement there, it is to completely revamp the so-called defense procurement procedure and make it a research, development and acquisition procedure, which is what other defense producing countries do. They start from research, go on to development and then into acquisition. We start from procurement, and therefore it's an import-friendly ecosystem with huge lobbies and vested interests which are totally preventing significant movement forward. So we have been trying to, we've met a few of the defense ministers, the defense secretary, defense production secretary, and try to impress this upon them. And technology is also extremely important for national security. It is at the core of the national security doctrines of China and the US. The US, in fact, has had an industrial policy since God knows when. That's how they created the markets and provided the patient capital for transformative technologies like aircraft, nuclear, semiconductor, etc. So that's the kind of, not that kind of, but I agree with distinguished panelists that we need to emulate some of the aspects of the American and Chinese innovation models and have an industrial policy suited for our own needs and address the specific negativities in our system, which is lack of R&D investment, which is still lagging business environment, and the lack of leveraging of domestic procurement to promote a high-tech economy. And we've given several proposals to government. We had a big campaign on the issue of the communications networks, which were monopolized by, Ericsson, Nokia, and mainly Chinese, which were getting all the government contracts. And we had a bit of a victory there with the BSNL tender being withdrawn, and then reissued, and some Indian companies got that tender, almost more than 8,000 crores. We've also given a proposal for a sovereign compute stack, which hopefully would create that kind of $1 trillion value possibility in India. Instead of our engineers emigrating, we give them the right conditions here. It's a very simple proposal, really. And we create the entire compute stack here from the design side. Obviously, fabs will come much later. Right now, our policy is to invite fabs, which means, that we never have the IPR. And so I think I've spoken a lot, and I would like to now stop, but I would welcome any kind
There's some interesting points you've made, so we'll get back to you on that. Subrata, you're in Ather. How do you see this Techscape?
Thank you, Surya. Good to be with some old friends and new. See, the way we look at EV industry, I think Jaijit gave the intro, but let me give the positive flip to it. He's absolutely bang on. China has done huge advancements in the field of EV, but where as an EV company ourselves, as an electric two-wheeler industry, we see the advantage is that for various reasons, the focus of China has been on the four-wheeler side. They built a massive ecosystem, but the focus is on four-wheeler. It is not too difficult to turn the attention towards two-wheeler. Possible reason is that Chinese economy itself has moved ahead. There's a huge demand for four-wheeler within the country. There's a competition to showcase their products better than Western products and or the Japanese products, and that actually leaves India in a very sweet spot. But we are very clear it has a defined timeline. As they say, the check will expire soon if we don't move in hard on this. And we are very clear the only way India is going to evolve as a clear global hub in EV is to start from the R&D phase. As a company ourselves, which has incubated came out of IIT Madras, we are the first ones to build the product right from scratch. Absolutely barring the cell, nothing is imported right from design. Everything is homegrown. That gives us a lot of advantage. All the code that is inside the vehicle is ours. We know how it exactly behaves. One of the reason why we have one of the best safest safety ratings in the electric two-wheelers in the country today. The consumer base is very tightly linked to us because we know exactly how the vehicle performs on the road and that. Because if you take the Indian auto industry, for that matter, other auto industry, and for that matter, even Chinese auto industry, they were depending on foreign technology, either West or Japanese. They were licensed. There is only that much you can do in that. And I think the Chinese form was that there's a limit you can compete on ice. Let's let's do something diametrically different EV. Similarly, if I have to say, let's say on the aviation, they said there's a limit you can pursue the engines with the West. Why don't you start the drones? And they are completely today leading that. I think we need to take the leaf out of this because EV, while it gives us an opportunity, and I think it's very important to say, see, Indian two-wheeler industry, the regular two-wheeler industry, is a huge export-oriented industry. We forget that while there is a huge domestic demand, there's a huge amount of exports which happen to Latin America, Africa, Central, Southeast Asia, and all. And that's a major gross earner. Sometimes, in this services-driven export, sometimes we ignore the manufacturing exports that happen. And if you see manufacturing exports, two-wheeler auto exports is significant. And you will see not just two-wheeler, three-wheelers. You travel in any part of Southeast Asia, you go to Africa, you will see some of the leading brands right on the road. I think we have the potential to when those countries also transition to EV. China right now focused on four-wheeler. As he rightly said, Japan for various reasons is still betting on ICE, hybrid and all. But I think in this particular industry, they are looking at India to learn that. For Japanese, obviously they have a big presence here in two-wheeler. China is very clear that if they can take the learnings, and you will have to take, because you have the manufacturing scale, you have the components, everything coming in. R&D in EV is slightly complex. Now again here I'll say, when you look at an automotive R&D, what used to happen earlier, you design the vehicle, large part of the components you actually outsourced. So the suppliers did R&D for you, you came in, you assembled them together. You need to have a great just-in-time assembly with TQM and all those concepts that came in from Japan, and you have to ensure that you gave a high quality product at the right time to the consumer with a very good serviceability. And you had a great product. But in EV, if you see, whether you see the Tesla model or you see the Chinese model, the entire R&D has moved in-house. It is backward, forward, vertical, whichever may follow it. It's a completely integrated R&D. And the partners who work with you in the R&D also are in-house. So, for example, if you are working with someone, say, a cell manufacturer, you are working with someone, say, for example, the frame. Most of the steel frame is being replaced by aluminum in the EV industry. So the forging, the press, those guys are also being come and see. So if you read some of the way how Tesla built the entire manufacturing ecosystem is by bringing those suppliers in from Italy and other place, make those press shops for the first time in the world. I think China has done the same model, and that entails a huge amount of R&D investment. And I think that's the game changer where Indian government and the Indian industry has to step in. R&D by itself is very high risk taking ability. You need the investment that goes in, capital has to be made available, because unless you do that scale, and it's not going to come up. And my last point I'll make is that while we have some policies which have come on around, say, PLI in manufacturing and that, what we need is to look into this as an holistic 360-degree solution. You start from R&D, design, manufacturing, because once you build scale of manufacturing, you can develop the component ecosystem here. See, let's say I manufacture 1 million vehicles, components will still come from abroad. But once you move into 20 million vehicles, all those folks will be forced to manufacture here. When they manufacture, the ecosystem grows, those R&D grows. So eventually you tend to become a global hub. And then it becomes very difficult for these guys to move somewhere else unless a bigger manufacturing hub evolves from that. I think once we look into this end-to-end ecosystem, from R&D to design, manufacturing, supplier ecosystem component, we can transform, and it's a huge opportunity ahead. I'll park here. So,
I think we'll come back to you in the second round. Sahu?
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here amongst the distinguished panelists. I think we can focus on AI a bit. It's more than a buzzword right now. It's a national priority. The government has a budget outlay of more than 10,000 crores for the India AI mission since December. And almost half of it is on compute, as Smita ma'am mentioned. Sovereign compute is an alternative. So what I think it's important to first understand where India is on AI globally, what are its priorities, and then to understand the enablers of AI, which are also the components of AI. So in terms of where India is on AI, is that India wants to focus on innovation while being mindful of risks. And this context is very important because AI first grew in the West through the foundation models. They leveraged AI to a particular extent, after which now the Seoul summit happened a week ago. Earlier, there was a Bletchley summit. They're focusing on safety. While India is also signing on to those documents, it's on their multilateral organizations. India recognizes as a leader of the global South that it hasn't leveraged AI as much as the West. Therefore, there's a clear focus by the ecosystem and the government itself on innovation and ground level use cases. And this has been socialized by leading technologists, say Nandan Nilekani and all. They propose that India should be the AI use case capital of the world. So with this context in mind, the Indian government needs to move forward on both sides. On one side, we have innovation and what it can do for us. On the other side, there are risks. For those risks, you need to have some regulation in some form or shape. Right now, India does not have a comprehensive regulatory mechanism. And right now, it's actually moot whether India should have a comprehensive regulatory mechanism. So in this balance, there are some enablers which India should be cognizant of. Those enablers are also the components of AI, namely data, second models, which could be foundation models or the subset of it, which are large language models. Thirdly, compute. And then finally, all three of them have to be looked with skilling, basically labor force to run them and develop them. So firstly, on data, India is a very data-rich country. However, the primary problem with the foundation models of the West is that they were trained on the English language of the internet, which is about 70 to 80% of it, and some Latin languages. So if India adopts the foundation models of the West, which currently it lacks indigenously, it's going to be representative of the data from the West. So there are initiatives like Bhashini, and then the Indian government is very fruitfully trying to convert India's indigenous knowledge digitally into a form which will be applicable for our use cases, for agriculture, for health. So that's data for us. In data, the regulatory bit, we passed a data protection bill, Personal Data Protection Act last year, but that was a framework legislation and much was left to delegated legislation. The rules have not come out yet. So in terms of utilizing data for AI, there is lack of clarity, but there is no lack of resource. So India needs to rejig its thinking and find innovative ways to use data for its AI ambition. Then moving on to models, India, as I said, does not have foundation models of its own. There are some very ambitious plans. We've heard of Bharat GPT, Hanuman GPT from the Bangalore ecosystem, but those are in their earlier days. India is still relying on open source models from the West. For example, India signed an MOU with Meta last year for using Llama 2. So at least in the short to medium future, we will be using open source models. So there, I think our international partnerships come into play. For example, the India-US Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, or the India-EU TTC, which is growing right now. The third part, in my opinion, is the most complex bit. It's the compute part. Compute, just what compute does essentially, it powers up those AI models to process the data or to make those calculations, which ultimately give us those end products. When we use ChatGPT, behind ChatGPT is the model of GPT. Behind that, there's a lot of computing. That computing helps in training of data, training of the models on those data. So on computing right now, India had a national supercomputing mission in 2014, but that has not taken off really well. Some public records estimate the computing power in terms of petaflops at 26, whereas the target was 66 petaflops. In December, the Prime Minister announced that India should acquire 10,000 GPUs for its computing goals. However, if you put that in perspective, Meta has the plan of having 6 lakh chips by 2025. So that ambition itself is displaced. Now, looking into the ambition itself, currently, my organization, Carnegie India, we are conducting some roundtables and discussion with stakeholders. Our understanding is that the understanding of compute itself is lacking. Compute does not mean hardware itself. Whenever we say compute, some people synonymously assume it to be semiconductor chips, but it's more than that. Compute is your hardware layer of the chips, which could be of varying varieties. It could be GPUs, it could be H100s, it could be other tensor processor units. Then you have the software layer, which is basically the programming languages which will run the chips for the outputs. Then you have the infrastructure layer, which is your data centers, cooling centers, and cables. So firstly, India needs to understand what compute exactly means. Then it needs to see if its ambitions are big enough. And thirdly, then there are third order, fourth order issues, such as we don't exactly know what the demand of compute is in India. The academic may have some particular demand, the industry may have some particular demand, which right now are being met by hyperscalers, basically the cloud companies. But what the exact demand is for which exact use case, that understanding is lacking. So I think I'll just stop here. I just wanted to give an outlay of the enablers for AI and what are some key basic considerations before we think of hurdles and before we think of our ambitions.
Commodore Golaya, your turn.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here in this panel, and I absolutely loved it that the first speaker started off by referring to the ships in the Navy. So as a former naval officer, that gives me a lot of this thing. I wonder how many of us realize the impact which the navies worldwide, not only the Indian Navy, worldwide have had on technology and on our lives. Even if you start with the GPS system, for example, that was initially for the military use, steered by the US Navy. The internet was a DARPA project. You mentioned about the naval technology. When Mr. Amitabh Kant, who was then the CEO, Niti Aayog, wrote a thing about India 2.0, that book, there's a separate chapter to the Indian Navy. And in the I remember the line, he'd said that Indian Navy should reinvent. So now Indian Navy not only reinventing, but also inventing. So we set up, you mentioned indigenization, ma'am. So indigenization is important, but what is more important is innovation. And there's a difference. The difference being that indigenization is you're getting what is available outside, you're getting it to India, which is important. And at the same time, making something de novo which doesn't exist anywhere in the world, which is equally important. So I do think that with the setting up of the NIIO in 2020, the Navy started focusing on both the things. I'd like to make 3 quick points here. One is something which I've been saying over and over again, and people are accusing me of repeating it, but I'll repeat it at the cost of. So first is due to a number of reasons, our country moved from the agricultural age to the information age without spending sufficient time in the industrial age. So what that implies is that our the ecosystem never developed to the extent it should have. And I keep giving this example. Everybody knows how a gas turbine works. Everybody knows how a jet engine works. If we cannot make it, and we probably will find it difficult to make it even with the transfer of technology, is because our metallurgy, for example, might not have developed because we did not spend sufficient time in the industrial age. Now, when the world is shifting to the information age, we have an advantage. Even if we are not the world leaders, you mentioned that we are not the number one, but the gap between us and the world leaders is suddenly narrowed. And we have to capitalize on that advantage. So that's the first point I want to make, that there is an opportunity here for the innovators in India, whether in the services or outside. And then services can make a difference, though everybody says, in the civilian field, the pace of change of technology is overtaken. I agree with that, but not necessarily. Again, I keep giving this example. Even if you're talking about MIMO, if you're using your mobile phones, let's not forget MIMO was The patent for MIMO was an Indian naval officer, Commodore Arun, who's of course now a professor emeritus in Stanford, but it was an Indian naval officer who came up with that idea. So that's one. But let me not get too much into the Navy. So let me get to the, you mentioned a thing about the EV. My question would be, and it's a generic question, it's not a question to you. Are we still thinking about the future or the information age with the industrial age mindset? You know, EVs, yes, China is investing quite a bit in EVs, but what is that one game changer which will, we use the term game changer quite loosely, but what is that one idea which can revolutionize the EV market? Possibly, instead of spending 1 hour to charge, if you can charge in 2 minutes, or if you can have a battery which can run for 2 years, that would be the game changer. Now, that is something which nobody else has. So should we focus on what everybody else is focusing on, which is also important, or should we looking at innovation, which by definition means coming up with something entirely new? So I think that is something where we have an opportunity. And as far as AI is concerned, I will say something which might possibly be controversial, but I'll say it still, not only in India, the world over, you will find, you're speaking about, the models, and we're taking open source thing, we're not taking anything, but you will find, and I don't know the reason why, I still haven't understood the reason why, but anybody who starts researching into AI gets into Sanskrit. And I'm not saying this lightly, I'm not saying, it's not a loose statement, it's not something about, our glorious past and all that, but Sanskrit being phonetically very, very strong has, and a number of papers have been written about what are the advantages of Sanskrit. So maybe we have advantages which we ourselves have not realized what the advantages are. So now with the focus shifting on innovation, with the government emphasizing so much on innovation, and if we realize what our advantages are and if we can leverage them, we will actually get game changers rather than getting things which are, it's totally cliche. This is a game changer, this is a game changer, everything is a game changer, but the game remains the same. If you make something which is totally, radically different, that is what actually becomes a game changer. That's what I feel. I may be wrong. I'm open to debate, but I think we have advantages which we ourselves haven't realized, which we need to recognize and capitalize on.
So some interesting points here in the first round, and I like the idea of Sanskrit. Before we come back, I'd like to take a short break, and don't go away. We'll be back in a little while. Welcome back to this roundtable on tech, where we have a distinguished panel with us. Anil, would you take on the next round?
Oh yeah, thank you, Surya, and thank you everyone for being here. Basdev, if I could begin with you. I think we had a great conversation which laid out opportunities and constraints. But when you go down to the deeper level, there's a strategic play here which we may all be overlooking right now. We all dwelled on the capability of EV, the opportunity for AI, etc. But in the whole EV space, there is a stranglehold on the green minerals that are required to manufacture the EVs. So, in 3 countries in the world control most of the sourcing, and 1 country in the world controls most of the processing, which is China. So, strategically, how do you see India working its way through this to realize, say, even the EV dream?
Well, that is one of the critical issues, in fact, that everyone flags when they talk about EV development. And I think a colleague here would be able to address it much better. But there are some strategies such as recycling that we can do, have alliances with countries which do produce, acquire, assets, in those countries which from which we can source those kind of materials. And I think for the foreseeable future, we'll continue to remain dependent on China. So that relationship also has to be, kept on an even keel for some time.
Actually, I want to follow up with you on the same point. How does Indian industry approach this challenge? Even assuming they have a will, they have a mindset, how do you get around this challenge?
Okay, I'll first refer to the naval officer's comment on how we look at the EV. Is it a single piece or that? See, at Ather, we are very clear that if you want to build a global hub and become a global product, it can't be a one-off innovation in one. It has to be multiple of that. And if you see the way how the product got evolved, just to give you small examples, EV was always conceptualized as a first world or a rich man's vehicle. Now you have to bring lot of those technologies down. Just to give you what we did in the vehicle, EV is very comfortable to ride. You want more women folk and senior elderly to ride that because it's a lot comfortable. Without gear, you can accelerate. But today, most of the places you see, you have a ramp. Whether you are coming out of a shopping mall, your own residential parking lot, or on your flyovers and all, and you have traffic. And if you can't hold the vehicle tends to slip. So the person needs to be tall enough to keep both the feet down to hold the vehicle. It's not possible. What we did was that can we make, using software tech, to come up with a very basic feature, one touch of a button, leave your hand, leave your feet, the vehicle will stand there. What is in your typical cars, the electronic parking brake, we were the first ones to bring it in scooter. First time anywhere in the world, and now it has become almost a de facto standard. And this was where it was innovation in India at play, because we had a very clear use case, Indian use case to work, and that worked in. It was there. Otherwise, if we had to say import the technology, it would have been prohibitively expensive, because it is on four-wheeler. They will give you to at a four-wheeler cost, license it, try to know it, just to give you one. Similarly, recently, we were known as making the best performance electric scooters in the world, and now a couple of weeks later, we are coming out with the first family scooter. And one of the things when we were designing it, that how do you make the scooter more safer for India? Because let's be clear, India is notorious for road accidents and that. Two things which we did, apart from the many which I'll share, is that when suddenly, see, this EV or any electric vehicle, it accelerates very rapidly. And when you brake, it will stop suddenly. And in that process, if it's a four-wheeler, you have lot of systems inside the cars are expensive, and the vehicle holds steady. How do you do that in a two-wheeler? You will see when you go into super bikes, 300cc, 800cc bikes, those sensors are there. Now, if I try to bring that sensor as it is and put on a scooter, possibly my scooter will be double the cost. They had to innovate right from scratch and said that, okay, can I get an anti-skid vehicle, so that in India, the scooter is typically 2+2, 2 legally permitted, you will always have 2 children there, so it's 4, the family of 4 is there. And when suddenly, and Indian roads are very notorious, a speed breaker, pothole, you don't know what comes up in front of you, you will suddenly stop, and the person can actually fall back or fall forward, or the scooter may topple. And that's why I said you need to have anti-skid in the tires, built in that kind of technology to stop. At the time, the technology needs to be affordable, no point making technology in. So at individual level, we had to get into this granularity of making it. So for example, in our case, we are the first one said when your vehicle falls, an alarm goes to your SOS, to your family or whoever, you say that with that GPS location, the vehicle actually fell down here, to know that. And we are the first one said the moment a vehicle falls down, the motor is cut off, because if you see, you have a lot of those YouTube videos, you go to help someone who fell down, you actually, while pulling the vehicle up, you end up actually accelerating it and you cause more damage. And we said, okay, when a vehicle falls down, can we cut it off, using software? So what I'm saying is that because we have gone into that R&D at that granular, at each and every module, sub-module level, I can do that innovation. Otherwise, what will normally happen is that you go to West or somewhere other part of the world, you say that I want to cut off the motor, give me a tech. So either you buy it from the motor person or someone else will give you the tech license. We said, no, you have to do it at that level and get it done. Your question on the one major fix, we believe standards is one place where India has a major role to play. And one of the things what we have done here is that, if you see, the charging standard has been defined either by the West or by Japan so far, those CCS2, CHAdeMO and all that. When it came to two-wheeler, they actually converted the four-wheeler standard into two-wheeler, and it said only you will do DC charging. Now in India, you don't get DC infrastructure everywhere. So when Ather innovated, we said we need to do fast charging. See, slow charging is easy, but consumer will not adopt, because you can't tell, say, a wage earner that wait for 4 hours of your productive day to charge your vehicle. as you rightly said, 15-20 minutes of charge, but then you need to do fast charging. But in India, you can't give everything on DC alone. So you needed a charger which does supports both AC and DC. So we were the first ones to innovate that. We actually opened it up now, so it's an open licensed one. BIS and everyone liked it. Now it has been adopted at a national standard, and I'm happy to say now globally, the global south is looking at it as an adopting, because the problem that India has, everyone else has. Unlike the Western Europe where the DC charging worked, the Type 6 standard, the Indian one we believe can take. So when I said R&D across all this along with standards, then you build an entire ecosystem that becomes a game changer, because you have the tech, you have the manufacturing, you have the standards, you own the entire component ecosystem, and then you can do that. To your question, Padma, on that issue of cell, see, I think where we are looking at, yes, there is today a cell dependency on that, but we are seeing there is a huge emphasis by Government of India alone, the ACC, advanced chemistry cell stuff happening here. We are seeing that, that's, we would have been a bit concerned if it was India's problem alone. Today, if you see, Europe shares the same concern, US is sharing the same concern, Australia. There is a huge development happening there. And to refer to our point, I think with this alliance that we have with folks, depending on that tech is not a concern. But where we would want to do work and where we are actually doing the work is, cell cannot be seen as a one monolith kind of a technology that you make a two-wheeler, he makes a three-wheeler, four-wheeler, the same cell will perform differently. Everyone has to harness the cell in a manner better for that. I think those are the kind of innovations R&D where we would want to go in, because how do I extract the best out of this cell for my specific product? And I think that's where again there's a huge gameplay for India, because you have the entire tech stack. Again, EV has a huge amount of hardware, software, firmware, where India has significant advantage. Chemistry is something that we are building huge in. We already had the automotive and the design legacy in India for the last 30-40 years at least. I think we are very well placed when we look at electric R&D, at least at the two-wheeler space. When I am saying two-wheeler, both scooter and bikes, right now the entire focus is on scooter, but even on the bikes, which is a huge market both in India and abroad, we are confident that this is ours actually to lose. If we don't do the things right, I think we can't blame someone else that something was taken away.
Jaijit, can I come to you before we move to the AI segment? Right at the beginning, you talked about how China saw an advantage and pressed home with it and became the global hub for four-wheeler EVs, as you mentioned. So, and you said that India needs to explore that. So, he's flagged, signaled one area where India could potentially go in, looking at the innovations based on India's use experience, etc. So if you were asked what is that one disruption that India should target, and really there is no infinite time, you're probably talking about next 2 years, right?
Sure. So let me just go a little step back and take up the issue in a little broader manner. This is a great example of what Subrata mentioned about innovation happening from bottom up. Now that happened because the government put a lot of focus on startups, and startups will figure out what is needed for Bharat. Right now the problem is that when we are looking at innovation, we are looking at it with a Western lens, and that's something that many of the panelists brought out, that even in innovation we want to replicate, or we are trying to solve a problem that we see with a very different lens. And that's where your question becomes quite relevant, that what is it that India needs? Right? We also need everything else, right? For sure, we need to have everything that the rest of the world has. So why don't we have a mechanism for top-down innovation? And I think now that people had seen the movie on the atomic bomb, I think Oppenheimer, so they understand what the Manhattan Project was. But that was my, my best example for 20 years to explain why we need a top-down innovation. Even in bottom-up, let's take the example of Jugaad, which is an excellent example of how you optimize assets. The same pump set that helped you do the agriculture, when you get the produce ready, you put it in a cart, and in front of the cart, you put the same pump set and use the same asset to transport that agricultural produce. But the moment it hits the road, it is illegal. And therefore, it falls prey to the local police and so on and so forth. Why hasn't it replicated from the Gangetic Plains to the south? Why hasn't that been, that innovation taken and made slightly better, safer, and recognized by the laws and taken it to the south? If you look at Philippines, Jeepney has a similar model. Jeepney is something that came out of World War II. It is not really manufactured by any known brand. It is a local manufacturing that happens, but the government stepped in and made it an industry. Now, not only people manufacture it, they also ride on top of it, and there is a large economy around it. So coming to, in fact, something that the ambassador was talking about of point procurement versus a procurement which is focused on the R&D also. So typically the contracts in US, for example, the defense contract specifically is about development and delivery on a 20-year period with milestones given in, which means that I'm assured that I will have a market once I've invested and developed that product. In India, it's a point RFP that I now need this. This is something that somebody else has manufactured for the last 7-8 years. You quickly put together a team, you invest, and if you get it, it's fine. Otherwise, your investment goes down the drain. Now, even if you get it, there is no confirmation that you will get the next deal and the next deal and so on. And therefore, will you be able to fund your team or not? If you don't fund your team, and there has been several examples from the Indian history, which I was talking about before we started this show, where we killed technologies that were created in India. Black and white television to color television. Great example which I was taking. 1979, Siri Pilani asked for their team which made the black and white television technology, and we were leaders in Asia. We were leaders ahead of Japan in having the technology which was completely indigenous. The first television in Indira Gandhi's home was from Siri Pilani. So this team said, can we now build color television? The response that came from the Department of Electronics at that point in time, there was the Department of Electronics, was that India does not need color television. So be it. And the request was for 1,07,000 rupees. 1982 Asian Games came in. The floodgates for imports for television was allowed, and our local brands of ECTV, Beltron, Keltron, they all became history. And now we are going back and trying to find the technology back inside. So again, coming back to the ambassador of how US and others had technology-focused drumbeat. In 1799, that was a time when the Mughal Empire was almost finished. Marathas were in control of this nation. In America, there was a report called the Report on Manufacture created by Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of US, which said, hey, look, agriculture is getting over as an industry. If I look at Europe, there is manufacturing coming in. That's the next quote-unquote .com happening, or the next AI happening, or whatever we call in today's world. Let's have a policy towards creating manufacturing. So it was called the Report on Manufacture. It did not say that the government will take the lead. It said the government will lead from the back. And it pushed the private sector in an organized manner with a drumbeat that start manufacturing and will provide all the support. That carried on for the next 200 years. When railway technology came in, the government of US said, let's go ahead and make US the #1 country in railways. Then telegraph came in, same thing. Right till now, when semiconductors came in, when US started realizing that they're losing the game on semiconductors with the friendly Asian giant, they came out with the entire PCAST set of regulations, the Presidential Semiconductors, whatever committee it's called. And no matter who the regime is, whether it's one president or the second or the one coming back or whatever, the policy stays undeterred, right? And therefore, there is continuity in policy of what is needed from top to bottom. Now coming to your question, which you mentioned, that what is it that one big thing we should do? There are multiple big things we should do, but I'll just take one example. There are startups which are figuring out what the problems to be solved in two-wheelers. It's an Indian problem. The associated issues are Indian. They're solving. They're doing a brilliant job. But there are places where the Indian government has to work with the private sector, like the Manhattan Project or like the batteries and EVs and so on and so forth. If you look at climate change happening, for sure we know that we will run out of food. Carrying 16% of the global population, if we do not have proper rains for 2 to 3 years, it will decimate us. It will decimate our population. We know the Harappan civilization was finished off because of climate change. We know the Roman civilization was finished because of climate change. The barbarians coming in was just the last portion. That was not the reason why the Romans got finished off. Many civilizations got finished off because of climate change. Carrying 1.6 billion people, are we even thinking of how to feed them? We have technologies in place. We can manufacture food in a factory. It's going to be 4 times or 5 times more expensive than manufacturing it on the field. But when there is no food available, that's what you need. That's what the entire world would need. That's what happened in 2007-8 when China said we are going to manufacture EVs. Nobody thought it's worth the bet. They took the bet. In 2009, even in India, nobody stood up and said, EV is going to be the next big thing. But the writing was in the wall. In fact, if you look at what Subrata's company Ather is doing, it's not just the E's and so on and so forth. How do you supply fuel to the remote areas in India? You can't. But you can supply a solar panel and you can supply a scooter. That makes them independent, and they can go ahead and have locomotion and therefore increase their income levels and increase their quality of life. Similarly, there are multiple such areas, starting with what I just mentioned. We need to put our focus on the next set of problems, which is food. It's staring at our face. We're already running down on our on our granaries. We don't have enough food in the silos. We are supposed to keep 2 years of buffer. That probably needs to increase to 4 years, which means we need to construct more silos, the entire supply chain, the steel that needs to get in. There needs to be new innovation, systems and sensors to keep track of it, to make sure that the grain at the bottom is not getting infected or rats are not eating it. What are the new kind of sensors that are needed? Whole bunch of things needs to be innovated around that area. And that's not just one area. There are multiple such areas. We just need to put up the Bharat lens in our eyes and start looking at the problems. In fact, one more thing I just want to say is picking up from where Commodore Golaya left, is that in AI he was mentioning that people go back to Sanskrit. I just want to leave with one single thought is yatha bhavo tad bhavati. You think you will be the world beaters, only then you can be the world beaters. Otherwise, we'll come very close to everybody, but we'll just stay very close. We'll not be able to beat them. And that's why the key problem that he mentioned was innovation and not just indigenization. It's important to benchmark ourselves as the leaders, and that's a big change in processes, in people, and in strategies that we need to put together to be able to reach there. It's not a very simple step forward. It's a massive step forward which needs to be done, and it starts from what we are thinking.
Just drawing from your point about how Indian brands were destroyed so many years back, has government in that sense, we see them doing a lot of things, semiconductors and so on, but has the thinking changed? Have they, this is a question for you also. What is your...
So clearly the thinking has changed, right? But as I mentioned, it's a massive churn that is needed. Are our schools aligned to that thinking? Has that change happened? The new education policy is just creeping in, everybody is confused. Are our children aligned to it? They're still reading the same stuff. If you look at even IITs, and I've been to 2 IITs and gone through that system, there isn't much of a bandwidth left for independent thinking and innovation. So much of curriculum and so much of load is stuffed in that by the time you have time to breathe at the end of the day is gone, right? Whereas you have so much infrastructure given at IIT, who's going ahead and using it? Who's using the innovation to create something new? Yes, there'll be 1 or 2 examples, right, here and there. But what have we really created out of the IITs? And it's not the fault of either the faculty or the students. It's a large process and system change that we need to do, which will then help the government back, right? But at least a starting point that the government has recognized that there needs to be a revolutionary way in which we think in order to catch up and have these next generation of technologies. That has happened. And so it's going to be a long journey. We need to accelerate that process.
Smita?
I like your point on education very much, and just want to make a related point that vocational education needs to be mainstreamed as soon as possible, because I've seen, in Switzerland and Germany, how CEOs come from the vocational education background. CEOs of multi-billion-dollar ABB, Schindler, etc. They've come from the vocational education background. And why? And I saw young children on the shop floor innovating with their hands, because as you have seen yourself, when you innovate from the bottom up, that's when you come up with fresh ideas and with game-changing ideas also. So I think that's a very important point. I agree with you, government has come up with a slew of excellent proposals and schemes. The issue is implementation. For example, they've come up with this preference to make in India, and I think tenders are absolutely critical. 20% of India's GDP, the public procurement system represents. If all that is diverted, focused on domestic procurement, imagine the multipliers in the economy. Imagine the resources you get for research and development. You said that we don't have enough incentives for R&D. It's because we don't get the orders. It's an absolutely critical issue that, patient capital is one aspect, but markets are equally critical. You have to have the markets on the other end. So on tenders, for example, you have such a complicated procedure. both in defense and in telecom, that your procurement, for example, of domestic items will be stymied when you put it under one category deliberately, because you've already fixated on that foreign Israeli or whoever producer, whom you can import from, and you've in fact written the specifications for that, and the one company was disqualified because its turnover was less than that particular category, and if it had come under the other category, it would have qualified. So these are the artificial ways we discourage our people, because, as I said, it's an import-friendly ecosystem, and this we've seen umpteen number of times in telecom and in defense, which are the two areas that we've tackled. So we really need to really come up with the capacity to innovate. You have to have the resources for it also. And that government procurement can greatly help.
Subrata, I just wanted to ask you, has Ather been able to cut that China connection, or how does that work?
See, today if you take the EV, thanks to schemes like the FAME or EMPS, which is the government's incentive for adoption of two-wheeler in the country, they are very stringent, you may call it localization requirements. And if you see that all the top leading brands have significantly localized their products to a large extent. So barring few things like say cells or certain semiconductors, you'll see a lot of products actually happen in India. But coming back to your question, where we see how to become that game changer is, we need to have a long-term policy consistency in India. Sometimes the policy keeps changing too frequently. I can understand the government and the bureaucracy is also learning, because there is a new technology, as the learning come evolve, but the industry needs to be given some kind of a timeline. And we need to look at a larger scale. This incentive was said it up to be 1 million vehicles. That's not sufficient enough. What we say is that look at a long-term policy. You may have this incentive or demand incentive, say for a period of 3-4 years. Production linked incentive was one-off. And our request is that, like semiconductors, mobile, where the government has a PLI 2, possibly a PLI 3 also. What we request is, auto being the largest manufacturing industry in the country, why don't you have PLI every 12 to 15 months and people can come? Today it's like, there is only one train which will go from Delhi to, or one flight from Delhi to Bombay at 6 o'clock. You catch the flight, good luck, otherwise you will never go to Bombay. What we are saying is that, why can't you have it every hour? There will be folks who will be joining it, because what happens is, as the manufacturing capacity in the country increases, your ability to innovate, your ability to localize the supply chain and bring down the cost and reduce dependency on outside increases significantly, and that actually benefits your consumer, and that will help you the scale also to ramp up. If you see any manufacturing, if you take from the books of China or Japan for that matter, it was actually scale. In Japan, it wasn't the domestic market alone. Domestic market, yes, but it was export. And see the scale they had created in 1960s, 70s. Koreans followed the same model. China did that, its scale. I think what India we need to do is that, fortunately, we have a great local market, but we need to innovate, make the product viable. Unlike China, where the per capita income is such they could afford an expensive product, in India, we still have to make the product, as Jaijit said, for Bharat, and it needs to be affordable. We can't make a 3-4 lakh great vehicle. What is the affordability price point? But to make the Indian consumer affordable product, I need to build the scale. Can I set up, let's say, can we have many more scooter, EV, electros, two-wheeler manufacturing plants coming in the country? Then you will have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers setting up the base here. Automatically the products become viable. And when you then go and try to export, you will be able to compete, say, with China with a very large manufacturing base, because your own manufacturing base is large. And here the working example is the Indian two-wheeler industry. You take great brands like, say, Hero, Bajaj, TVS, who are ruling the entire global south in terms of exports, is because of the massive scale of manufacturing they have. Even China is not able to displace them. They are holding their ground with great quality products and with repeat orders in this market. And for EV to emerge into that, we need to get into that scale. Like, for example, two-wheeler industry in India approximately has somewhere around 1.8 to close to 2 crore capacity to manufacture. But if you take EV, it's hardly anything. We need to at least create, can we create, say, 5 million EV manufacturing facility in the country? You consume and then you are able to export around the world. And
If I
that
may
will be needed.
interrupt you here, Who's preventing you from doing it? Is it a policy handicap or is it an investment?
See, it's, I'll put it many places. If you take at the policy level, for example, production linked incentive is a great scheme. Those who got qualified, they had the benefit, but you had a host of companies who got left out. What we are requesting is that if you have this scheme regular, it's a 16% incentive scheme. The 16% is, it doesn't, it ends up creating an uneven playing field. So if you have that piece in play, then you are able to create large scale in that. Similarly, we have this government incentives for customers to buy, but states say, we'll give it only to the first 100,000 vehicles. That won't make a difference. Why don't you look at, let's say, at least the top 10 states in the country, say every state will give up to 1 million. Then you are talking about a 10 million vehicle base, then industry can go and produce. If you have schemes which the duration is say just 4 months or just a year, you are not able to do a long-term planning. And to come to this question, in China, the planning is for 10, 20 years. The industry knows, the government knows, the ecosystem. It's just not me alone. No, he is my tier 1 supplier. He will have a tier 2 supplier. She will have a tier 3 supplier. All of us needs to plan. And if you say the window is only 6 months to plan, you just can't think, because we are not sure what will happen 6 months later. Will it be a better scheme? Then all this investment is at risk. Or you are thinking that, maybe the scheme will go out, then this investment may go waste. So that some policy clarity will make the game changer.
Commodore Golaya, you talked about innovation in the Navy. You were driving innovation in the Navy. Now we know Navy early on had got into building its own ships a long time ago. So tell us something about this innovation. What's happening actually?
So I would come to that, but let me move away from the Navy for a while because there've been so many interesting things said in this conversation. Believe me, whenever this is aired, I'll be taking notes and I'll be thinking about, there's a lot of food for thought which has been given. Kudos to whatever innovations you've done. But the point which I was trying to make, sir, is totally different. You used, both of you, in fact, used very interesting words. You said that the problems of the global south, our problems are the same problems as the global south, so we can straight away take this thing there. The point which I was trying to make is we understand their problems, they understand our problems is one thing, which is nice. But if we come to what he's saying is that we are still trying to see the innovation for Bharat from the global lens. If you link up these two things, and I'll link it up to what you said later. You're talking about we understand their problems. Our problems are their problems. And I'm not playing with words. If our solutions start becoming their solutions, that is the time we would have made the leap. And to do that, we have to think from the Bharat lens. So the question which you asked is that we still have a dependency on the rare earths because, all the batteries need that, which may not come down because, due to whatever reasons. But the question which we should ask, and this is the question which you asked him, that what is the one big thing which you should aim for? And his answer was right. There are hundreds of big things which you can aim for. But if energy is going to be the energy, whether it comes from the sun or from electricity or nuclear or whatever, if energy is what do we have the biggest reserves of? The sands down south contain something which can power, but we haven't worked. We have been working, but we still haven't produced say thorium, this thing which can be scaled. Which again links to what I said, if you can make a battery which runs for 2 years. Now, obviously nobody else, which may bring down your dependency. So if you say there are only a few countries, we do have, I think, a lot of rare earths, it's just that we don't process them. But if you say very few countries have the rare earths and very few countries process it, so they have capitalized on what was their strength. Have we capitalized on what is our strength? So if our strength is that we have the largest deposits of this, which potentially, and everybody knows that it potentially has a use which can actually revolutionize the EV sector. If it can, then are we looking at harnessing that source so as to make it usable? Because if we don't, nobody else will. So as of now, we are sitting on a gold mine or a potential gold mine, but we don't know that we are sitting on a gold mine. So that is where the innovation would have to come in. And that is why I loved what you said, that we are looking at, I would call it looking at the future while being firmly in the past, which is also important. Which is important. You have to be rooted in the past while looking at the future, but you cannot see it from somebody else's lens. You have to see what is unique to you, what are your advantages, and how can you leverage that. And with that, I'll come to your question. So what is the Navy doing? Navy is doing essentially that. When we set up the NIIO, the Naval Innovation and Indigenization Organization, the question people asked us that Navy has always been at the forefront of indigenization. I mean, why do you need a new organization? So one, of course, was that we needed to move from indigenization to innovation. Second is, I think we realized the top-down approach. So this NIIO is totally top-down. And the third thing which I think we realized, and which is important, the mindsets required are totally different. Indigenization requires somebody who knows the rules, who follows the rules. Innovation requires mavericks. It requires people who are... So Navy, you asked a question about the Navy, so otherwise I wouldn't have made it Navy. But Navy realized that all the out-of-the-box thinkers, because in the services we are taught to...
obey orders.
Obey orders plus think, dress, talk alike.
Yeah.
But they're mavericks everywhere. So what has been done now is that the TDAC, which I used to head, is a very, very small organization, but all the out-of-the-box thinkers in the Navy have been told no hierarchy, directly communicate with NHQ. And that is producing results. In the first few years, we filed more than 50 patents. So that happened because all the out-of-the-box thinkers, regardless of rank, were told and were given the freedom that we realize that you think differently. We respect that, and you don't follow the chain of command because innovation cannot happen through the chain of commands. So top-driven, yet spread out. So that's and the last point which I wanted to make, but I won't, because I countered more or less everybody or added to what everybody was saying. I wanted to disagree with something which the ambassador had said. But I have realized one thing in life, that you never disagree with what diplomats say. So whatever you said is right, ma'am. I agree.
No, it's a learning process. So
no, I'm just joking. But when I said I'm playing around with words, that's something which diplomats do, of course, quite nicely.
No, I've totally given up that life. So I'm here to learn.
I was just joking, ma'am.
Just to clarify, India called for auction of harvesting rare earths only last year. And
Yes.
there were no takers, by the
No.
way. So
my point was, why rare earths? Why not?
sorry.
Can I, with your permission, add to that? So while we're looking at the source of raw material, critical minerals, there's a downstream industry that we already have, which we are doing nothing to protect. Because there's a critical minerals committee whose allocation of business rules says that you will focus on getting the critical minerals in. Now there's an industry which is already importing the raw materials and then transforming into steel, going into Navy, going into the nozzles of ISRO's rockets and so on and so forth. But when it starts competing with, let's say, the Koreans, where we have signed a free trade agreement, they get the raw materials at 0%. Our industry pays 2.5% for the same raw material for a 2.5% difference, which adds up to about 20 crores annually. We are killing that industry. And so, just amplifying your point, it's not just the raw material, it's the entire supply chain. We are using the word ecosystem again and again, but when the rubber hits the road, we forget the word ecosystem. We look into the allocation of business rules. My allocation of business rules says only raw material, and I'm not concerned about the rest of the supply chain. It is important that we change the mindset, exactly what he said. The mindset change is important. We need to look at the entire supply chain to ensure that India becomes a leader and an innovator in all the areas that we're talking about.
And if I can just quickly add, sir, I absolutely agree. I mean, both, again, linking what you have said with what you said, I fully agree with you, continuity. I mean, if as any business which is not sure if the policy is going to remain the same after 6 months, or after 1 year, after 2 years, it becomes very difficult. Continuity is something, continuity in policy, continuity in, and you can't even say that, this is a thrust area and 2 years later the thrust area has changed. It doesn't happen that way. So I fully agree with what you said there.
So, final round, perhaps a word from each of you as to the way forward. What do we do now? Where do we go? Maybe Commodore?
So where we go is we change our mindset from a mindset of indigenization to a mindset of innovation.
How does that happen?
It happens. So you mentioned that the new education policy is there, but it has. I think it is making a difference. I think it is making a difference. It will take time. If continuity is provided, if we encourage our people to start thinking from the Ather tinkering labs in schools, they're making a difference. It will not change overnight, but the people who are now in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. I mean, if we say that a policy has been introduced and 2 years later you go to IIT and you find that everything has changed. It doesn't happen that way. But slowly over a period of time, in rural areas and semi-rural areas, still the parents' this thing is that a child has to. You mentioned, ma'am, about the vocational training, but the parents will say my child will do only engineering. You say that, I mean, whether he's got marks, he's got the engineering, medical. There are only two professions as far as the the tier 2, tier 3 cities are concerned, and they want to focus only on that. Whether the child has the talent, whether the child has the inclination.
And the interest.
And the interest. But that is something which I find is changing. And with the new education policy, which has just been introduced, it's, give it time. If you give it time, and time is required, I do think it will make a difference in 5-10 years. Definitely, we'll see the changes.
Sahu?
Sir, I think my point may be a little radical, maybe off the mark, but so Commodore sir mentioned focusing on innovation, and Jaijit sir mentioned how we should look at being the best. We're missing one key topic in the past few years, which India has been doing really great, is digital public infrastructure. It's not manufacturing per se, but it's an innovation by itself, and it's an enabler of innovation as well. That's where India is the prime leader. There are other countries who are doing great with DPIs as well. There's Brazil with Pix, Singapore with Pay Now. But that's a good case example to see where did we go right, because we went right with many things there. We did ID, we did payments, we did data exchanges, and now we're looking at innovation in other aspects such as ONDC, Open Network, or digital commerce. So that's a success case. There, India is not a tech taker. There, India is giving the tech, the expertise. Now DPI is going to be deployed in the global south. Most recently, Trinidad, Tobago, and Malawi, they're uptaking the India stack. So that's a good case study to see not only the people, not only the tech itself, but the people who led it, what was the attitude, how did we look at it holistically. So I would say if we're going forward, then let's not forget where we succeeded immensely, which is DPI.
Subrata?
So my takeaway would be from this is that if the government is able to put a long term, we have that 100,000 crore R&D fund which has come, but if we can, they are targeting at sunrise industry and some deep tech industries. Our request is EV can be identified, give it a 10-year fund, have some strict targets so that there is no misuse of fund by the industry, look into how much of patents are being filed, how much is being granted, how much of that is actually translating into actual product which is both getting consumed domestically and exporting, and not just an R&D for the sake of R&D, and link that up and then give an incentive link to that. Let there be very stringent norms. The industry completely supports that, but there needs to be a backing, and look at a 10-year picture, integrate that R&D with manufacturing. Then we are able to build the scale, and I think that will make the difference across, and not a piecemeal approach of 1 year, 6 months, or we will do it and tomorrow we do something else. The industry is also able to plan big. Funds are able to, investors, both domestic, international, green funds, then they are able to look at it, because India has the potential. I think the Indian, at least electric industry, both 4-wheeler, 2-wheeler, that demonstrated it. You see the amount of penetration of EVs on the streets of Delhi and others is a testament to the fact that the products are working, Indian consumers are taking. But how do I make the product affordable to the larger mass and make it into an export oriented industry, and then go after the global markets? And that's where this integration of R&D, support to R&D, local innovation, patents, standards, how do we take more and more standards from India into the global pool? This is the first standard that we are taking into the Indian, the charging standard, which I said Type 7 Lex standard. Now we are taking into IEEE for adoption for the global as an alternate to what had come from the West. But how do then till 2030 can we take 10 or 15 more standards there? Let's have that as a national endeavor, and then let's go towards that, because then you're changing the, that's where you're changing the entire game. You're not just doing a point innovation, you're doing the standards, you're doing the innovation, and then you'll impact the manufacturing, and then you'll see 2040 your plug points, like your 3-pin plug, USB-C is now a global de facto standard.
Yeah.
Can we have a similar standard coming out of India? You may give it a name, but then everyone uses it, because your back-end manufacturing is then aligned, because you don't have to change. Imagine if the standard, if you are dependent on someone else, they change it, tomorrow you have to make all the changes yourself. But if you are innovating the standard, If that becomes a global norm, then your manufacturing, supply chain, everything knows, okay, this is what we need to do, and you can go after. I think there's a huge learning which you can take from that, and it is doable. All of what I said have already been demonstrated with 1 or 2 examples. Only thing is that how do we take from 1 or 2 examples to say 100 and 1000 examples to make it work large scale?
Ambassador?
So I just wanted to mention, vocational education doesn't mean the 6-month courses that we do here in India. It means absolutely top of the line engineering degrees, for example, or medical degrees. The difference between the Swiss and the Indian engineering degree would be the Swiss actually get hands-on practice in the enterprises. So they are absolutely employment ready. That's what I meant by vocational education. So I think if we can make it prestigious enough, or give it another name if necessary, but incorporate some of those ideas into our system, that we make the children employment ready, so that the engineering graduates then don't go and sit for the IAS exam, for example, or the medical people also. So that's the first thing. The second thing is indigenization does not rule out innovation. When we talk of indigenization, we mean let us now have our own products in telecom networks, for example, because it's a huge security issue. The Chinese, for example, were bidding for all the government contracts. And even the armed forces have been freely buying, foreign equipment. Cisco, for example, it's all over the place. So this is what when we talk about indigenization, it's not just copying other things. It's about creating our own products and substituting all the foreign products to the extent possible. All we can't do, because there are supply chain issues, there are R&D issues, there are capability issues. Whatever we can substitute, because we are so import heavy in the high-tech sphere. Same goes for defense. We need to cut down our import bill, and basically for our own security. For example, I've already referred to the Ukraine-Russia battlefield scenario. Russians have been able to out-innovate constantly. $1.26 trillion budget that the NATO has. Russia has just recently ramped up its defense budget to $86 billion. So unless you have that innovation, indigenization base, indigenous defense industry, you cannot do that. Like you have been, innovating upwards. And I totally agree with you about the top-down Manhattan-style projects. We have been requesting government, 5G mein kariye, supercompute mein kariye, sovereign compute stack, and defense indigenization. For example, we are seeing a lot of joint ventures in defense, which are just a cover for foreign companies to come here and without very much value addition. And the screwdriver assembly operation incentive schemes that we see around us have to be replaced by scaled up design linked incentive schemes. We had in fact written to government about that, and then they came up with the design linked incentive scheme. But it's very small in scale compared to the PLI, which is, according to some government officials, encouraging assembly operations. I'm sure that good things are also happening under it, otherwise it wouldn't be so popular. But there has to be a more emphasis on R&D intensive, incentives for R&D intensive production rather than assembly production. So this is what we'd like to see: a sovereign compute stack coming up, 5G, which is completely in India based. It's a security issue also, because 5G plus AI, military, the military intelligentization that is taking place is a direct threat. You're already seeing robots in the Ukrainian battlefield killing humans, and all remote controlled. And if you think that just by jamming the signals you're going to stop it, it's not always possible. What the Russians have done is, for example, they've created sensors on top of that particular equipment, so that jammers on top of that equipment, which can jam the signals coming from a satellite, for example. So it's not just the jamming from the radars; it's also innovation for that. So you have to constantly out innovate your adversary, and that can only happen when you have a complete government and industry partnership, domestic industry, indigenous industry.
Jaijit, last word.
I think a lot of wisdom has been already shared, so there's very little that comes to the last person who's going to add any value to it. But essentially, we're all agreeing to the fact that technology is the big disruptor, right? It disrupts the fabric of how we live, how we work, and so on and so forth. And therefore, to be able to be in the cutting edge of technology leads to more jobs, greater industry, and prosperity for the nation. Now, to do that, we can go through indigenous development of technology. We have seen that takes 25 years, 30 years, it just goes on. But it should go on, right? And that's important. And there are technologies being developed by startups such as Ather and so on and so forth, and great to do. Along with it, the government has started moving funds away from government institutions, government-funded R&D to private sector, which is again a great move. But what I see, because I'm in the committees of many of these committees which actually gives the funds, is that small amount of funds are given to small entities all over the place. 50 lakhs, 1 crore, 10 lakhs, and the whole fund is 200 crores. Now, what if I give 50 crores to an Ather and say, here is what you need to do, here is what we think is needed, the military will pick up so many million vehicles if you develop it, and will make sure that the export happens to Philippines, Mexico, this and that, which is what the Foreign Office can surely support and help and do. So backing up larger capable companies and trusting them is one of the things that needs to be done. The third thing is that we should also be looking around and scouting and buying out companies which are at the cutting edge of technology. Now, because areas like UK, Germany, Japan are going through a bit of a challenge from an economic perspective, they're great pickings to be had. And that's what China did when USSR broke down. That's what we should be doing, and taking companies in which have technologies, or buying out the technology, or getting the people in. If we have Israelis coming in, Russians coming in, Germans coming in fact, the first fighter plane that we had was developed by a German. But Kurt Tank developed the first fighter plane, and it was one of the best in the world, created in India. It was underpowered because of the engines, but in terms of aerodynamics, it was cutting edge at that point in time. So we should be open to that. Now that leads to new technology models coming in, and there are a few more things that we need to look at, but I'm just leaving it over there. But with the new technology models, there are new business models that starts coming in. As I said, it disrupts. Technology disrupts. So new businesses that never existed before start coming up. Ola, Uber, Google, all of that we are all aware of what those technology models are. Those business models are. Now, because of the business models, new operational models starts coming in. We should have the ability to keep innovating, not just at the technology level, but beyond that. A good example is Israel, where they're doing a large number of technology innovation. They even come out with a company, and then it's bought out by the Americans, right? And there have been questions asked by policymakers in Israel that why should we give tax breaks to these entities, who then eventually get bought up by the large American tech giants? And the answer they have found within themselves saying, that's what we do. We like agriculture, we create new technologies, they get harvested, we come out with new technologies which disrupts the previous one, and life goes on. India is not Israel. We are, again, 16% of global population. We are almost the center of the world in that sense. And therefore, arguments which say that India should only focus on IT or one particular sector, I wouldn't believe it personally. India should be focusing on everything, from manufacturing shoes to pens to pins to rockets to everything. That is why we stayed together as one large entity. In fact, Commodore Golaya was mentioning that people have aspiration of being engineers and doctors. That has changed to being programmers and doctors. Within engineering also, we have left out all other sectors, and therefore all the metallurgy that is needed to come out with a new scooter or a new tank and so on, we have limited ability from a human resource perspective. The last part of the model, after having the business models, is we need enabling regulatory models. We opened up the drone industry. It was a sheer brilliance from the government's perspective, where in spite of all these challenges, that what if the drone goes into the engine of an airplane while it's taking off, it'll kill people. They fixed it. They came out with a regulation that works. We have one of the largest drone industries in the world. That's what we need to do. Even in AI, all that I keep hearing is, how do I wrap up the industry and tie it up from all sides so that it can't move? Well, look at AI. There is a consumer side of AI and there is an enterprise side of AI. Enterprise are big enough to figure out what are the problems that they will have. If there is a solution to figure out how to efficiently raise a PO and automatically pay it out, there is no consumer data getting involved. Why bind it up? So we should be focusing on how we have new regulatory models that frees up the new businesses that are coming up and make them world-class and push them out through our foreign offices, through our linkages, through our geopolitical heft, which this government has done greatly in terms of creating that geopolitical heft. Let's leverage it and create industries around it.
So we finally come to the end of what has been a extremely animated, informative, and very heavy conversation. So it's very difficult for me to attempt to even sum up. But I'll take up from Jaijit left off. He laid out beautifully the fabric and the vision before us. But the main takeaway that I see is that yes, there are challenges, but yes, India can. And to draw from Shatak's example of digital public infrastructure, which has given India a global stage thanks to its own homegrown indigenous venture, which we all know popularly as UPI or Unified Payment Interface. But more importantly, for all this to happen, there has to be a fundamental mindset reset in this country. And not just for government, I think among all stakeholders, whether it's industry, citizen, innovators, otherwise, as the ambassador and commander said, that indigenization and innovation cannot coexist. Thank you for watching.